I was 54 the morning I finally turned off Highway 6 and followed the old gravel road that led to my daughter's lake house. A place I had avoided for 2 full years, as if grief itself were rooted in the soil there. The air was gray with early autumn, and the windshield fogged lightly each time I exhaled. A quiet reminder of how long I'd been holding my breath where Emily was concerned. I had convinced myself that returning would be like lifting the bandage from a wound that had never healed, an act required not for courage but for the simple preservation of whatever was left of me. For 2 years, I had carried her absence like a stone in my chest, heavy enough that even the thought of Clearwater Point made my ribs tighten. But the house was still in my name, still being maintained through the payments I made each month without ever driving up to see what remained. I told myself it was time, that I needed to face the stillness inside those walls. Grief can trick a man into believing time alone reshapes pain, when the truth is far simpler. Time only waits for you to stop running. I expected decay. I expected the porch boards to sag under the weight of 2 years of neglect, needles piled in damp clusters across the steps, windows clouded with dust and storms. I expected emptiness, and perhaps, in some quiet part of myself, I hoped the emptiness would mirror my own. Instead, as I turned the final bend and the house came into view through the trees, a different sensation spread through me. Something colder, tighter, far more disorienting than sorrow. The garden was alive, not just overgrown but maintained with a precision I recognized instantly. Dahlias in full bloom, staked upright exactly the way Emily used to do in late August. Hydrangeas trimmed along the base, each cluster shaped with the tidy discipline of someone who had watched her carefully. Even the lilies, delicate and temperamental, stood without browning edges, as if they had been watered on a schedule far more consistent than anything nature could provide. I parked beside the house and stepped out slowly, the gravel shifting beneath my boots. The porch railings, once chipped and sun-bleached, had been freshly painted a soft cream, matching the exact shade Emily had chosen during her last summer alive. The windows glimmered, polished so thoroughly they caught the lake's reflection. The welcome mat, the one she bought years ago with the faded lettering, had been replaced with something new, something that didn't belong to her hands or her taste. Every detail carried an implication I wasn't ready to articulate. I walked up the steps, half expecting the wood to groan under my weight, but everything felt stable, recently tended. Someone had brushed the pine needles from each edge. Someone had swept. Someone had cared in a way that required intention and time. When I reached the door, I noticed the lock's brass plate, polished, free of weathering, as if hands had touched it daily. My throat tightened. I unlocked it with my own key, though a strange resistance met the turn, a faint indication that the mechanism had been lubricated recently by someone other than me. Inside, the air was wrong. Not stale or abandoned, but warm, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of vanilla candles. Her candles. She used to light them in the evenings while she cooked, letting the house fill with a sweetness I once teased her about. The scent now felt like a hand closing slowly around my ribs. It wasn't possible. No candle burned for 2 years. Someone had lit them recently. Someone who knew what she loved. The living room held the same arrangement she'd left behind. Her books aligned on the shelves, the throw folded over the sofa's arm, but the surfaces were spotless. The wooden floors gleamed under the morning light, free of dust, free of time. I placed my palm on the wall to steady myself, feeling the faint warmth of a house that had held life in the last day or two. A faint hum came from the refrigerator. When I opened it, the truth sharpened. It was full, not with old leftovers but with new groceries. Milk dated only 3 days prior, fresh fruit, packaged meals, a half-used carton of eggs. Someone had been here long enough to settle comfortably. I moved from room to room in a slow, deliberate walk, the kind a man takes when he is not afraid of danger but of memory. The kitchen counters had been wiped down with lemon-scented cleaner. The pantry was organized meticulously, more meticulously than she ever kept it. Cans rotated, labels aligned. I touched the ceramic mug on the dish rack. It was still faintly warm, as if washed moments before. The guest bedroom was made with unfamiliar sheets. Dark blue, neatly tucked, purchased by someone who did not know her style. Even the mattress looked disturbed, the faint impressions of a body still soft in the fabric. I found a toothbrush in the bathroom, a comb, a bottle of deodorant set beside a brand of shower gel Emily never used. Every item said what I had not yet allowed myself to say aloud. Someone had been living here long enough to forget this house belonged to a dead woman. Upstairs, in Emily's old room, I paused at the doorway. I hadn't been able to cross that threshold the day we packed her things, and I hadn't returned since. The door was ajar now, as if someone had passed through casually, unburdened by the reverence I carried. Inside, the bed was made with her old quilt, the one her grandmother sewed when she was 13, but the pillows were arranged in a way that wasn't hers. A chair had been moved to face the window overlooking the lake. On the desk, the dust was disturbed, wiped clean by a hand that did not know which objects were sacred. I stood there longer than I should have, breathing through the ache rising in my chest. At some point, my avoidance had allowed someone else to step into her life as if it were simply available, unprotected, unguarded. Grief had kept me away, but grief had also left the door open for whatever had moved in and made itself at home. Finally, I walked back downstairs and stood in the center of the living room, the silence pressing in close. There was only one explanation, one truth forming with a cold clarity that steadied me more than it frightened me. I had installed cameras in the lake house years ago, back when Emily insisted on spending weekends alone. She never knew. They were a father's private safeguard, a quiet precaution he hoped he'd never need. I had not checked them in years, but now their memory cards were the only witnesses left. I realized then that what waited for me on those recordings would not just answer who had been living in her home. It would tell me what I had allowed to happen by staying away. And the weight of that knowledge settled into me like the first drop of a long winter. For 2 years after Emily's funeral, my life in Duluth slid into a shape that felt less like living and more like surviving in a dim, quiet room. Grief can make a man smaller without him noticing. It can sand down the edges of his world until all that remains is routine. Routine is predictable, and predictable things don't hurt. I clung to that thought as if it were medicine. My days became narrow corridors. I woke while the sky was still an indistinct gray, brewed coffee without tasting it, and went to work in the same deliberate silence that settled across my apartment like a permanent fog. My colleagues learned to speak around me gently, as if volume alone could fracture what remained of me. They avoided mentioning her name. I never corrected them. It was easier to pretend the quiet between us was compassion rather than fear. Most evenings, I returned home to a place that had stopped feeling like home the moment she died. I kept the lights low, not out of preference but because bright rooms made the emptiness more visible. Meals were simple, mechanical things, reheated soup, toast, eggs. Nothing with enough preparation time to force me into the kind of thinking that leads to memory. I would sit at the small kitchen table, listening to the clock tick through minutes that felt heavy and indistinguishable from each other. Sometimes, when the silence grew particularly dense, I would open Emily's old voicemails. I told myself I played them to hear her laugh again, to remind myself that she had existed in the world as more than the last pale version of herself I found in the hospital. But the truth was simpler and much lonelier. I wanted her voice to tell me what to do with the life I'd been handed after hers ended. Her messages were short, reminders about grocery lists, updates about the lake house, soft apologies for missing dinner. But I clung to them, even when the familiarity of her tone twisted the knife a little deeper. At church, people touched my arm lightly and said they were praying for me. Their voices softened, as if grief had rendered me fragile. I nodded and thanked them. Their kindness was real, but it belonged to the earliest days of mourning, not to the long, quiet stretch that followed. I learned quickly that after a certain point, grief becomes private. People stop asking questions not because they don't care, but because they're certain you don't want to answer them honestly. I didn't blame them. I isolated myself further than anyone needed to, not out of bitterness, but out of something closer to resignation. I convinced myself that if I stayed still enough, quiet enough, maybe the ache would loosen its grip. Instead, the world around me contracted until it felt no larger than my dim kitchen and the rustling static of my own thoughts. Brady, my son-in-law, drifted away with a speed that should have alarmed me, but at the time, I mistook it for another natural consequence of shared grief. He had moved to the lake house with Emily after they married, but after she died, he stayed only long enough to pack his things and avoid difficult conversations. He told me he couldn't bear the memories, couldn't look at her kitchen, her porch swing, her handwriting on the calendar pinned near the fridge. He said the silence there was too loud. The irony of that statement was not lost on me later, but at the time, I let him go without question. He began calling me sporadically afterward, not to talk about her or us or anything human, but to ask for money. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Each request came wrapped in some plausible excuse. A job falling through, a medical bill, a financial hiccup he promised would right itself soon. I paid him without argument. A father who loses a daughter learns quickly how to choose the battles he still has the strength for. Letting Brady slip quietly out of our orbit felt easier than confronting the questions I couldn't bring myself to face. Emily's best friend, Nicole, stayed in touch only through brief texts, tiny bursts of sympathy peppered with heart emojis that felt too easy, too rehearsed. She never visited. She never called. She never asked how I truly was or whether I needed anything. I didn't resent her for it. People have limits and grief exposes them. Still, her distance became another stitch in the fabric of isolation I wrapped around myself, one I mistook for healing. There was one thing I could never fully silence, though, a nagging unease I kept buried beneath layers of logic and exhaustion. Something about Emily's death never sat right with me. The doctors had explained the sudden heart failure with clinical precision, using phrases that carried a finality I was too numb to challenge. I signed the paperwork, nodded at the explanations, and pretended my mind wasn't stumbling over details that refused to settle. There were things I noticed at the hospital, things I dismissed because grieving fathers see shadows where there are none. The missing pill bottles from her usual medication bag. Brady's refusal to look me in the eye when he recounted the hours before she collapsed. The way Nicole stood too far away during the hospital briefing, her expression unreadable. But the mind does what it must to survive. Mine convinced itself that suspicion was a betrayal of the daughter I loved, that accepting a natural cause of death was the only path that did not lead me into madness. Loneliness has a way of talking you into the safest explanation, even when the truth is tapping lightly at your door. So I folded those uneasy thoughts into the quietest corner of my mind and labeled them grief's distortions. I told myself everyone else had moved on because they had healed, not because they had something to hide. I lived that way for 2 years, shrinking my life down to manageable pieces, convincing myself that the lake house didn't matter anymore. In reality, I was terrified of walking back into her world, of facing a place that had once contained her laughter, her routines, her habits. I feared seeing it frozen in time. I feared, just as much, seeing what time had done to it. But when I stepped into that house and felt the warmth of candles that had been extinguished only hours earlier, when I saw the groceries in the refrigerator, the bed made with sheets she never owned, when I stood in the center of that living room with the air still holding the soft heat of another person's breath, the truth arrived with a clarity grief could no longer dilute. Someone had not only entered Emily's home, they had inhabited it, comfortably, regularly, quietly, and I had been too deep in my own loneliness to realize something far darker had been unfolding in the background of the life I had let collapse into silence. I understood then that returning to the lake house had not been the reopening of a wound. It was the uncovering of something that had been living beneath it all along, waiting for me to stop looking away. And in that moment, standing in the stillness of her home, I realized that the cameras I'd once installed as a precaution were no longer relics of a father's protective instinct. They were the only eyes that had been watching when I wasn't. I waited until the house had settled into its late afternoon quiet before sitting at the small oak table where Emily used to sort through her mail. My laptop felt oddly heavy in my hands, as if it already knew what it was about to reveal. The cameras I'd installed years ago were never meant to be intrusive. They were precautions left over from a time when I worried about break-ins, storms, or the long weekends she spent alone at the lake. After she married Brady, I stopped checking them entirely. The recordings had become one more relic of a life untouched since her death. But now, the memory cards were no longer a sentimental leftover. They were evidence, though I didn't know of what yet. The first clip loaded slowly, buffering just long enough to give my heartbeat time to miscount itself. When the image finally sharpened, the front door appeared in the frame, a familiar sight, though now burdened with attention I wasn't prepared for. A figure stepped into view, unlocking the door with a key I knew I had never given him. Brady. He moved through the house with a casual ownership that caught my breath. No hesitation, no caution, no reverence for a space that belonged to the woman he claimed had been the love of his life. Instead, he carried grocery bags under one arm, whistling softly, an aimless, tuneless whistle that suggested contentment, not grief. He wore the jacket Emily had bought him 2 Christmases before she died. Seeing it now, draped across the shoulders of a man who had barely visited her grave, felt like a small blade sliding between my ribs. He set the groceries down on the counter and moved about the kitchen with practiced ease. He knew where the pans were stored, where the spices were kept, where the knives hung. He lifted a pan from the rack with the kind of muscle memory that only comes from repetition. My hands tightened on the laptop. This wasn't a man visiting a place for convenience. This was someone living here comfortably. A moment later, another figure entered the frame. Nicole. Her hair was damp, curled at the ends as if she had just stepped out of the shower. She wore flannel pajamas I didn't recognize. Not hers. Certainly not Emily's. She walked barefoot across the living room floor, glancing in Brady's direction with an expression far too soft, far too familiar. She laughed at something he said. An easy, unguarded laugh that suggested this routine had been playing out for much longer than I wanted to imagine. They cooked together, moved around each other in smooth, synchronized patterns, passing ingredients, brushing fingertips, leaning close enough that their shoulders touched. None of it was clumsy. None of it carried the awkwardness of a new arrangement. This was habit. This was established. This was lived-in betrayal. I watched them sit down at the kitchen table, the table where Emily once spent lazy summer mornings reading medical articles and drinking tea. Brady poured wine into 2 glasses, and Nicole nudged his hand playfully when he spilled a drop. They looked like a couple who had practiced every small intimacy of domestic life. But it was the conversation, faint at first, then sharper as the camera auto-adjusted its audio, that drew the room tight around me. Brady leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping into a confidential murmur. "We need to finish transferring the property before the old man wakes up." The words struck like blunt force. I felt the weight of them settle across my chest. He meant me. He meant the lake house. He meant the quiet inheritance I had left untouched out of love for my daughter's memory. Nicole answered him by lifting a forkful of pasta to his mouth, her voice threaded with a calculated calm. "Then you need to stick to the timeline. No improvising. We can't afford mistakes now." Brady laughed softly, private, secretive laugh. The kind a man uses when he feels victorious long before the battle is won. I sat up straighter in my chair. My breath slowed, not out of shock, but out of a sober, growing clarity. These two were not simply trespassing. They were not simply meddling with a property that wasn't theirs. They were strategizing. I advanced the video. Nicole reached into a drawer near the sink and pulled out a thin envelope. A familiar one. My signature, my forged signature, was on the front. I recognized the shape of the paper, the crease where I always folded documents along a precise line. She slid it across the table. "Here," she said quietly. "You'll need this. It worked once." Brady opened it carelessly, almost bored. Inside were the documents authorizing a change in Emily's medications during the month leading up to her death. He tapped the papers with a fingertip, unimpressed by the gravity of what he held. "She was dead weight," he said, the phrase tossed out casually, as if he were describing a broken appliance instead of the woman he once married. "You kept saying it had to look natural." Nicole's voice dropped to something colder. "And it did. She never should have made it to the hospital. You panicked. You almost ruined everything." The floor beneath me seemed to tilt, though I knew it hadn't moved at all. I was the one shifting. Something inside me, a belief, a memory, a foundation I had trusted, began to give way. They continued speaking, unaware of the camera trained on their every word. "You'll get the house," Nicole said, leaning back, "and I'll take care of the medical records. But we need to keep things quiet until it's finalized." Brady nodded, running his hand through his hair with a mix of irritation and impatience. "I just want it done." The simplicity of that statement, the cold desire for completion, hit harder than any accusation could have. They had planned this. They had engineered it. They had taken my daughter's life apart piece by piece, then moved into the remains as if the rubble belonged to them. I didn't know how long I sat there after the clip ended. The house around me felt smaller, the air heavier. Grief, the familiar old ache, withdrew into a corner, overshadowed by something sharper, something shaped like truth. Not rage, not shock, just the inevitable settling of a final, undeniable fact. Emily hadn't died from some cruel twist of nature. She had been removed, and the people who did it were living in her house, eating at her table, sleeping in her rooms, forging my name, and planning their next step as if the world would bend itself to accommodate their lies. When I finally closed the laptop, my hands were steady, my pulse slow. It was not calm I felt, but a clarity forged from loss and realization. A clarity that does not shout, does not tremble, does not break. It simply understands. I understood that the truth was no longer hiding in shadows. It was right in front of me, and now that I had seen it, nothing, absolutely nothing, would remain untouched. I didn't move for a long time after the final frame of the recording faded from the screen. The house felt different now, heavier, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the truth I had uncovered. For 2 years, I had walked through grief as if through fog, believing sorrow was the worst thing that could settle on a man's shoulders. But sorrow was quiet. Sorrow mourned. What sat before me now was something far more solid, something that required direction, not despair. I closed the laptop gently, the way I used to close Emily's textbooks when she fell asleep studying at the kitchen table. Then I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a long, steady release that seemed to pull my thoughts into alignment. Rage didn't rise in me. I'd lived long enough to know rage wastes time. I felt instead a calm that bordered on coldness, an understanding that the truth had presented itself not for my anguish, but for my action. The next morning, I left the lake house before the sun slipped fully above the tree line. The air carried that faint metallic chill northern Minnesota holds in the early hours. I drove south, following the long stretch of highway toward Brainerd, where Emily had filled her prescriptions for years. I remembered the pharmacist, Anna, a quiet woman with a warm smile. She had watched Emily grow from a teenager into a thoughtful, sharp young woman who always asked questions about her medications and dosing. Emily had trusted her. When I walked into the small clinic pharmacy, Anna looked up from behind the counter, her expression softening with recognition and something like sympathy. My presence there must have told her more than my words ever could. "Richard," she said quietly, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the air around us. "It's been a long time." I nodded. "I need to see her records," I said. "The last month of her life. Everything." A shadow of hesitation flickered in her eyes. She didn't ask why. She simply led me to a partitioned desk at the end of the counter and pulled up the files. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, like she already knew she was about to reveal something neither of us wanted confirmed. The records printed 1 page at a time. I studied each sheet as it emerged. Her heart medication, the one that stabilized her irregular rhythms, had been replaced. Not discontinued. Replaced. The new prescription was an experimental supplement marketed as natural support for cardiac function. But Anna explained in a hushed tone what I already sensed. Some patients experienced a dangerous decline in heart stability. It was not a medication for someone with Emily's medical history. My name appeared on the authorization line, except I had never signed it. "I remember when this came through," Anna said, her voice tight. "It surprised me. You always asked questions. You were careful. And Emily, she didn't seem comfortable with the change. Who picked it up? I asked. Anna hesitated again, then printed the pharmacy log. She placed it in front of me like she was laying down a fragile truth. Brady's signature. And beside it, another handwriting I recognized from the forged envelope in the video, Nicole's. I took careful copies of everything. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't tell Anna what I knew. I simply thanked her with a nod, my voice steady enough to reassure her that I wasn't about to break open in front of her counter. When I stepped outside, the sunlight was too bright. It pressed against my eyes as if the world were unaware of the weight I carried. I sat in the car for a long moment, letting the engine remain silent. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was an organized pattern, deliberate, practiced, and confident enough to assume I would never look closely. I drove to a small convenience store miles outside of town and paid cash for a prepaid phone. I flipped it open in the car, feeling the unfamiliar lightness of its plastic body. My hands didn't shake. Calm can be unsettling when it settles on a man at a time like this. But it was a calm rooted in understanding. There are battles that require shouting, and there are wars that require silence. This was the latter. I drove back toward Clearwater Point but didn't return to the lake house. Instead, I rented a room at an old motel off the highway, one of those dim places that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee that had been burned through multiple pots. The anonymity suited me. I checked in under a shortened version of my name, paid with cash, and kept the lights low. On the small motel desk, I laid out the printed records, the forged papers, and small still frames I had captured from the recording. I arranged them in a deliberate order, not to understand what had happened, but to understand who these people became when they thought no one was watching. Their patterns, their tells, their cracks. Fear is a fragile thing in guilty people. It takes only pressure in the right place to make it splinter. I typed a series of messages on the prepaid phone. Not threats, not accusations, just carefully placed reminders, references to details that only I, Brady, and Nicole would know. I mentioned the medication change, the forged signature, the night they cooked dinner, Emily's quilt on the bed. I sent each message only once and deleted the thread immediately after it delivered. Not enough to reveal I was close, just enough to unsettle the ground beneath their feet. I watched from a distance over the next several days, driving past the lake house at dusk, observing the rhythm of their movements. Their routines began to shift subtly. Lights flicked on at unusual hours. Their car remained gone longer than expected. They stood farther apart when they talked on the porch. The easy, practiced intimacy I saw in the recordings began to crumble. Brady's gestures grew sharp, impatient. Nicole's posture tightened, brittle with suspicion. Guilt, when properly awakened, doesn't shout. Corrodes. It gnaws. It whispers doubts in the ears of co-conspirators until they begin turning toward each other with accusations rather than trust. I knew enough about human nature and enough about them to let that erosion happen slowly. By the third day, Brady drove into town alone. He stayed out for hours. Nicole paced around the lake house porch, her phone clutched tight in her hand. They were unraveling just as I had expected. People like them don't stand united under pressure. They fracture. I spent evenings in the motel studying the documents, planning my next step. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge is noise. I needed something quieter, sturdier. Something that would hold up not only in the court of law but in the court of truth. My goal was simple. Expose them without ever raising my voice. I contacted the sheriff's office from the prepaid phone using a blocked ID, saying only that suspicious activity was occurring at the lake house. I did not provide details. I wanted them alert, not prematurely involved. By the end of the week, Brady and Nicole barely spoke to each other except in sharp, stunted exchanges. They looked over their shoulders more often. They shut curtains they once left open. Guilt had settled into the marrow of their days. All I had done was tap the first crack. Their fear did the rest. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that I had already begun setting the stage for something much larger. A silence that would swallow them. A truth that would speak for me. They had orchestrated Emily's death believing they were smarter, faster, more coordinated than anyone who might stand in their way. They returned to the lake house on a Thursday evening, just as the sun sank low enough to cast the pines in long, fractured shadows across the gravel path. I watched from a distance, positioned in the cover of the treeline, the same place Emily used to stand when she wanted to surprise me arriving for weekend visits. The air hummed with the first hints of a storm, a heavy electric stillness that made even the leaves tremble. In another life, it might have been a beautiful scene. Tonight, it was the prelude to an ending. Brady's truck rolled into the driveway with a jerk, the tires crunching over the stones with an impatience that betrayed his state of mind. Nicole sat beside him, her posture rigid, face angled toward the window as if bracing herself for impact. They didn't speak as they got out. There was none of the casual domestic rhythm I had seen in the recordings. No shared laughter, no soft remarks. They moved like two people forcing themselves into proximity because they were more afraid of being apart. Guilt had matured into something sharper. Mistrust. I waited until the front door shut behind them before stepping forward just enough to glimpse the living room window. Lights flickered on inside. Their silhouettes moved across the walls, sharp, animated shapes thrown into motion by fear. They were arguing already. Even from the yard, I could sense the rising pitch of their voices, shards of sound breaking through the storm-thick air. It didn't matter what they were saying. I knew the shape of guilt-driven conversation. Blame disguised as fear, fear disguised as strategy, strategy collapsing into panic. Earlier that morning, I had completed the final preparations. The locks had been replaced, quietly, efficiently, by a locksmith who asked no questions about the short time frame or the additional payment I pressed into his hand. I had rerouted the camera system, connecting a live stream directly to Sheriff Keene's office in Crow Wing County. I left an anonymous message on their tip line with the exact time Brady and Nicole were expected to return. I didn't tell them what they would witness. I didn't need to. Truth speaks loudly when people are desperate enough to reveal it. Inside, their voices climbed higher. I stepped closer to the window, not to hear them, but to observe their posture. The way bodies move when the lies they've built begin to collapse under their own weight. Brady paced back and forth, gestures sharp, erratic. Nicole leaned against the counter, arms folded tightly, as though bracing herself against a storm that had been gathering long before today. They weren't strategizing anymore. They were unraveling. Brady slammed something onto the table. A folder, perhaps. I couldn't see, but I didn't need to. The forged documents had become their shared anchor of guilt. Nicole jabbed a finger toward the living room, her lips moving quickly. Brady shouted back. Something about messages. Something about being watched. The edge in his voice carried a fear I had carefully cultivated. Then came the line that pierced the house like a blade. Brady shouting that switching Emily's pills had been Nicole's idea. Nicole recoiled as if he had struck her. Her face contorted with shock, fury, and something else, betrayal. She fired back, her words sharp enough to cut through the walls. I saw her pick up the bottle of supplements, the ones that replaced my daughter's medication, and thrust it in his face. She said he was the one who pushed her. He was the one who insisted Emily was standing in the way. He was the one who wanted the house, the life insurance, the ease of starting over without her. Their argument spiraled. Every detail they had hidden, even from each other, rose between them like a wildfire, burning through whatever unity they had pretended to share. They spoke in full sentences now, confessing not out of regret, but out of desperation to shift the guilt onto the other. And all the while, the small red LED of the camera blinked silently from the corner of the room, capturing every word. The distant rumble of thunder rolled across the lake. The storm was building, but slowly, patiently, like justice approaching at its own pace. It didn't take long before the sheriff's vehicles turned onto the gravel road. 2 deputies emerged first, moving with the quiet precision of people who know the weight of unspoken evidence. Sheriff Keene followed, his face set in the calm, unreadable expression of a man who had listened to the live feed long enough to understand exactly what awaited him inside. I didn't step forward. This moment didn't belong to me. Truth had its own momentum now. They approached the porch, flashlights slicing through the dim. Inside, Brady and Nicole froze, as if sensing a shift in the air. The first knock was firm, not aggressive, not hesitant, but final. When no one answered, the sheriff called out, announcing their presence. I watched as the tension inside the house imploded. Brady grabbed the forged envelope. Nicole clutched the pill bottles. Both of them stumbled toward the door as if trying to hide the evidence in plain sight. The deputies entered calmly. No shouting, no guns drawn. Just a quiet collection of authority stepped into a room filled with panic. And then the moment came, a deputy pointing at the camera in the corner, informing them that everything they had just said had been recorded live and observed in real time by law enforcement. The blood drained from Brady's face. Nicole went rigid, her fingers dropping the bottles, letting them clatter across the hardwood floor. For a second, they stared at each other not as partners, not even as enemies, but as two people who had finally understood the extent of their own arrogance. They were handcuffed without ceremony. Brady shouted accusations, voice cracking, insisting it was all her idea. Nicole screamed that he had manipulated her. But the deputies didn't react. They'd heard it all already. Their confession had unfolded in the one place people like them never expect to be watched. Their own panic. When the door finally shut behind the sheriff's team, and the sound of their vehicles faded down the gravel road, the house fell into a silence I had not heard since the last summer Emily lived there. A clean silence. A restored one. I remained at the tree-lean, letting the storm breeze lift the damp pine scent into the air. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. Those emotions belong to victories that come loudly. This was not that. This was the quiet settling of truth into the place where lies had lived too long. Justice, when it is done correctly, does not shout. It simply stands. I didn't enter the house that night. I didn't need to. I let the rain begin its slow descent over the lake, washing the porch, the steps, the garden that had been tended by unworthy hands. I walked back to my car, not hurried, not triumphant, just steady, carrying the weight of a father who had finally done what grief had once made impossible. Months later, the lake house would become something Emily would have loved. A quiet retreat offered to families navigating loss, a place for people to sit in stillness without being swallowed by it. Her name hung on a small wooden sign beside the porch. Flowers bloomed freely around it, alive this time for the right reasons. On the first morning of spring, I stood on the porch with my hand resting on the railing she once painted. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale sky. A breeze moved through the hydrangeas she planted years ago, and for the first time since losing her, I felt something close to peace.